Well, to tell you the truth, I handed my editor a great mass of stuff. And I wrote rather artful, well, not artful, but art-intending introductions to everything. And then the editor picked them all himself, picked the title and everything out. So that was it. And I think it's much better. Editors, I've always, you know, on newspapers, I've always liked editors very much. I may think I'm smarter than they are, but their ideas, for some reason or other, always turn out to be better than mine. So I was perfectly satisfied to go along with this. When my editor picked it, I was very interested in it because I thought I intended to write as best I could an article about a successful man of color of the 20s and what happened to him. The adoration he faced, which was always tinged with condescension of a sort. And then when he strayed from the path of orthodoxy, the particular punishment he received, all of which I felt had to do with the fact that he was a man of color. Well, Paul Robeson was a great many things. He was the second black All-American football player at Rutgers. He was on Walter Camp's All-American team, which was then the All-American team. And he, after he was, then he was also a Phi Beta Kappa at Rutgers. So there he was, black, Phi Beta Kappa, and an All-American football player. He then went to a law school where he didn't do a law firm where he didn't do too well, partly because they weren't very anxious to take him into court. It was a very distinguished downtown law firm. Then he was discovered as an actor, and he became a famous actor. The Emperor Jones was, he did for O'Neill. And after the Emperor Jones, he then became a concert singer and became something of a movie star. I think you can see him on AMC and various other things. Then he fell in love with the Soviet Union and Stalin, and then was absolutely drummed out of society, American society. He came back to the United States, died here. They took his picture. They used to do that when I was a boy. They don't do it anymore. But they took the listing of Walter Camp's past All-Americans. I believe in one of the sports guides, they took Paul Robeson's name out. And he'd been the All-American sometime in the teens. And they took his name out because he was such a scandal. And this is sort of a piece about this. And at the time, when I was a young reporter, I used to be very derisive of him. And so I mean, it didn't seem to me to make sense that someone could like Joseph Stalin, but he did, but that was only part of his life, and we made it the whole of his life. Well, not me. I didn't go quite that far, but America did. Well, I used to they were very sweet to me because I worked for them for about 2 years after I left daily journalism. Not a good idea. So I used to write a piece a month for them, and then every now and then I'll do articles for them. The New York Review of Books is, it's a wonderful literary magazine, which is full of my betters, and it has a very distinguished reputation. And I've sort of known them. It was formed originally during one of the newspaper strikes of '62, I think '62, and it was formed to compete with the New York Times Book Review, which many publishers were annoyed at, as people always get annoyed at these things. And then it developed, and it became it has an enormous amount of prestige and weight. Every now and then they'll pick up a newspaper piece of mine, and I always find out, I hate to say this about my delightful employers, but I always find more people read it in the New York Review than do in Newsday. but that it's one of the things that happens if you write in daily newspapers. I live on the west side of Manhattan. I've lived in and around New York for about, I used to live in Princeton. I left Princeton and moved in here. I've been living in New York physically since about 1960, except for a brief trip here in Washington. Yeah, I write 4 days a week. Newspaper columns a week. Yeah. Not so as you'd notice. I have a tiny syndication. I was editor-at-large of the New Republic between 1962 and 1963 here in Washington. That was just Clay's first fight with Sonny Liston. And when he surprised everybody by winning the heavyweight championship. And it was just that kind of piece. I mean, it was just a piece of reporting on a fight. Not a very good piece of reporting on a fight, by the way. Everybody, I think, no matter how young, has probably heard of the March on Washington. And he was organizing the March on Washington. Randolph was president of the Pullman Porters Union, a very tiny union when they had Pullman Porters, which they have in a few places still left. And he used it. It had at most about 10,000 members, all black Pullman Porters Union. And he used that to organize the civil rights movement in 1942. Then he did the March on Washington, ran the March on Washington. Oh, the March on Washington? Mm-hmm. Yes, that was his idea. He had wanted to do one during wartime in 42, but he was dissuaded from that, and then he came back and ran this one in 62, which was an effort to push the civil rights laws. But he was about as close to universal recognition as a saint as any black leader. I think of all of them that he was, because he was a man utterly without envy, entirely without ambition, no style, no pomposity. Yes, I saw him once or twice. Very much the old-fashioned gentleman. Malcolm said he was less confused than than almost any other black leader he knew, but Mr. Malcolm thought he was very confused. Then Mr. Malcolm found out that life is very confusing as time went on, too. Yes. I always called him Mr. Malcolm. I didn't know him that well. I mean, our relations were kind of ambassadorial. He was a very classy guy. I always think one of the problems with journalism is, one of the mistakes in journalism is thinking that people are coming your way and will agree with you. I don't think Mr. Malcolm was ever coming my way or agreeing with me. But he was very interesting. Actually, when I was doing the Clay Liston fight, I spent the longest time with Mr. Malcolm, because he was there with the then Cassius, now Muhammad Ali. And we sat and talked for about, I guess 4 or 5 hours at the Gaston Motor Inn, it wasn't the Gaston, but it was the Motor Inn of color in Miami across the, and Clay was staying there, Malcolm was staying there. And at one point, I mean, this is a deviation, but at one point I said to him, I was talking about the black Muslims because I'd covered a lot of black nationalists before. And his Muslims, a lot of whom he lost, were all, I said, the thing I liked about them, impressed me about them was they weren't frightened. That most black nationalists, when they would come down to our neighborhood, would, if you touched them, they would think you hit them. So Mr. Malcolm said, this is great. I've got to get Cassius Clay, and this man will tell him that Muslims cannot be afraid, because Clay was fighting this dreadful specter, Sonny Liston, the heavyweight champion at the time. And Mr. Malcolm's secretary came back from looking for Cassius Clay, and Cassius Clay had gone to the airport to meet Ray Robinson. So I said to him, you know, Ray Robinson was a very famous fighter of our time. And I said, Mr. Malcolm, I think any advice he gets from Ray Robinson will probably be much more serviceable than any he'd get from me. But he was very, there was something very moving about Mr. Malcolm. And, he was a, you know, I think that he was a genuinely splendid guy in many ways. And it was a very sad story because, you know, you get killed by your own in this business, you know. He was killed by tribal cops who wouldn't lay a hand on me or you or anything. The Telegram was sort of a, it was very nice place to work. If you could answer Mr. Lamb, why newspapers go out of business, I'm not sure you may not have had something to do with it in your time. I mean, we were, you know, MTV has really rather made life difficult. It was owned by Scripps Howard, and it was a very famous paper in its time, very distinguished. It was an amalgamation of the old New York World with the old New York Telegram with the old New York Sun. Its full name was the World Telegram and Sun. And then it, too, headed for losses. We had a tremendous number of papers in New York. When I first got there, we had, I think we had, I can remember 7 or 8. And then they kept getting together all the time as time went on. And finally, there was then a grand amalgamation of the New York Journal of America, the New York Herald Tribune, the New York World Telegram and Sun into one paper, and it went like that. Didn't last. So I left and went to the New York Post, and then I got really sort of fed up with journalism. Not with journalism, with daily papers. I was very disillusioned because I'd loved working for the Telegram. It was so respectable. I mean, if you got hate letters, they were signed with the full name of the man who wrote them, which always makes you feel you live in a high-rent district. Baltimore. Well, actually, yes, I was born in Baltimore, and I spent my first 3 years in Philadelphia. Then my father died, and my mother went back to Baltimore with her family. My father, I suppose, lives in history for having been one of the victims of the great flu epidemic of 1920. He was a stockbroker. I don't think the Kemptons were people of vast luck. I think if things had gone, if he hadn't gotten the flu, I think the 1929 stock market crash might well have. Well, my mom went back to Baltimore, and she worked, which was considered both admirable and a little embarrassing. And she worked for a department store in Baltimore called Hutzler's. And she was I had the only mother I knew when I was growing up who worked. So I thought it was very strange. But she was wonderful. She worked up until the time she was about 60. She was a buyer at a department store. And in her way, sort of, well, she wasn't a pioneer, but because there were an awful lot of buyers in department stores, and they were all women in those days. But in the sort of shabby genteel world from which I came, it was sort of odd to have a mother who worked. I had an older brother, wonderful guy. He died last year, or 2 years ago. Times sort of collapsed. So I don't know anybody, I think, in Baltimore anymore. Johns Hopkins. Political science, which I don't recommend. It's a waste of time in a way. Well, it certainly was a waste of time in my time because we studied the governments of Germany, Italy, well, Germany and Italy and the Soviet Union, which sticks in my mind. And of course, Germany and Italy went bottom up because we studied Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and they went bottom up. The Soviet Union hung around a few more years, but it too went bottom up, so that my education in foreign governments has been very much overtaken by events. What was my first job? I was a social worker, a welfare worker, and I did very badly at that. And then I came to New York and worked for labor unions. And then I went to the New York Post, and I was there, I guess, about a year. And I went in the Army. New Guinea and the Philippines, and Tampa. and Fort Camp Wood, New Jersey. I mean, I don't want to sound as though, so I went to New Guinea in 1943 and stayed there till 45. I think that's about right. In 1945, I don't know what I was. I guess I was a Democrat. I was very briefly in college, a member of the Young Communist League, and then I left that and became a socialist. And then when I went in the Army, or before I went in the Army, at that time, I was pretty much nothing, except I used to vote Democratic fairly loyally. And when I came out in 45, I guess I was pretty much nothing politically, except, you know, a Democrat. I mean, I believed that Roosevelt had done all sorts of marvelous things, and the country had no social problems. And then I covered labor for a long time. And I had a view up until maybe 1950 that America was this perfect country produced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I guess the CIO, which was then the labor, you know, the more progressive labor movement. And then I guess about 1951 or 1952, I began to get a little cynical about all those things. I don't know who did it. I'm not wildly fond of it, but well, I couldn't really look that unpleasant, could I? I look like William Kunstler if he lost his élan. But anyway, it was nice, and random house wanted to use it. So I don't know where it came from. It was the New Yorker had done it, and they sent me around to have Avedon take my picture, and he gasped and said, "You couldn't take a picture of me." And the next thing I saw when this piece came out was his caricature. I think only four. I think this is only my fourth book. I have been rather kind to the history of literature as far as turning out these things. The most generous person I've ever known. I used to write one or two things for the National Review, but they didn't work out terribly well. They were very sweet about them, but no, I just known him for a long time. He wasn't the first person to teach me that asking a man his political views is not necessarily the soundest way to find out about his character. And I've always just found Buckley remarkably generous. I once told him, because of his capacity to overrate people, that I wish he were president of the United States, because if he were, every unemployable person in America would have a job. And he took that with a certain amount of grace. But, you know, I mean, he's addicted to generosity the way a junkie is to heroin. And I do like him. And, I mean, I wasn't just being perverse. Well, this was a piece on the reporting that Karl Marx wrote for the Herald Tribune. And it's really an appreciation of Marx's way of looking at things and describing them and his intuitions. Marx, now you give me trouble. Let's see, he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And I suppose he died. It's very embarrassing. He went through the Civil War, he was active, he died in 1880, and I think when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, I don't even remember Marx's dates. It's awful. However, he was a magnificent social analyst. And and this is really an appreciation, an effort to be an appreciation of Marx's powers of analysis in these articles. He wrote from London. He was the London correspondent of the Chicago Tribune, largely, I think, because they could get him cheap. And these dispatches were picked up in this book I was reviewing, and the insights were very interesting. Because Marx had, this is a whole problem of journalism. Marx had no sources whatsoever. except the papers and the British Museum. And of course, he had a great break because the British, anywhere else in the world, if you had a cholera epidemic, they didn't count the bodies, but the British were apparently magnificent about counting the bodies. So he liked England because he could trust the statistics where he couldn't anywhere else, that he never lived. But what happened was, you would read these pieces, and then I happened to be reading once or twice in the same period when he'd have an article on the British parliamentary situation. I was reading the letters of Disraeli, who was in the parliament at the time and an insider, and Disraeli's analysis of the balance of power in British politics and Marx's analysis as the complete outsider were exactly alike. And that's has always told me, that one of the problems in journalism is that people think, well, if I can just get access to the people who are making the decisions, I will know what is going on. When the truth is, I've never been able to do it, that you can look at the situation from the outside and do almost as well. Henry Kissinger used to say that he could always tell what the quarterback was doing in a football game, and I used to think, well, so can I, but I'm not being hit over the head. So the outside analyst can be better in many cases than the insider, because the insider's being hit over the head. But the idea that if I could only get to talk to the president, I would know what we're doing in Bosnia. Now, my suspicion is, if you look at the president's record in this area for the last year, I don't think the president knows what he's doing in Bosnia. So the insider, unless he's very, very smart and very, very keen, the insider isn't worth much more than our using our heads and trying to figure out what's happening. I go to the office. I usually go down to the street and try to find something to cover. I mean, the inside of my head is really not a terribly populated premise. So I usually try to go around and get a story about somebody else, not me, and then feed off. I mean, I've often said, I've never written a good piece that didn't have a quote from somebody else, even if it was only in a book. So that I do like to get around. I mean, I think that's the fun of journalism. I don't know how long newspapers will last, but they're wonderful places to work. I think probably better than to work on television, although it depends on where you get sent. I mean, I've gotten so old, nobody sends me out on stories much anymore, but so that obviously, if you're sent to someplace that's really very exciting, then television is fun. But I think most of the time, the newspapers are they're more fun to work on, I think. Now, maybe people will look back. I was saying to somebody today, we're constantly looking back on ages of lead and saying they're ages of gold. And so I don't know whether newspapers were as much more fun in my youth, because I was having much more fun. But I think you can still have a lot of fun on newspapers. Well, it is an affectation. I tend usually to listen now in my declining years to classical music, or what is called serious music, not classical music. And I don't listen too closely. I usually listen in the office. I put the Walkman on because we had a mayor who shot his mouth off a lot, and I did not want to be taken unawares by his voice in the street, so I started playing this, and I've stuck to it. Edward I. Koch, who was, as he got to his third term, as happened to most politicians, just got to be really very annoying. You'd hear him screech on the street if you were not careful, which is why I did it. Although I'm very fond of Koch, I didn't mean to criticize him. But his rap got a little tiresome after a while. I try to leave the house about 8, and then usually I go to the street and mess around and see if I can find something to write about. Then come in at 4 and write. That just, just go around town. Maybe I'll go cover a trial. Maybe I'll cover a press conference. Maybe I'll cover, if there's an event. I read the Washington Post, of which I'm terribly fond. I read the New York Times. I just go through it before I go out. I look at television news shows. We have a very good local Channel 1, which they took away from me because my building went another cable. But, and I look at that. And that's about it, I think. Generally speaking, I don't read contemporary material. I'm really too old. I read novels. No, I don't really feel that old. But I am that old. And, my assumption is that I'm 70. Am I 76 or 77? I'm 76. I can't imagine working another 4 years, more than another 4 years. And that, that gets a little pressing because you really think there are a lot of things that you would sort of like to cover that you won't cover. Or do you see what I'm trying to say? I'm not being dramatic, but you do feel there's just not that much time actuarially. And so I would like the next 4 years or the next 5 years or whatever it is, not to be sedentary. As you get older, you write more slowly. And I think that's probably because things don't seem quite as simple. Everything gets a little more complicated. You get into when people say something, you say, oh, he's not that bad. Or they say something congratulatory, it's laudatory about someone, you say, he's not that good. The business of trying to keep a balance is very, very hard. And as a reporter, there's only one or two things that I am reasonably proud of. I always thought Truman was very underrated in, say, 1952. And I think now he's rather overrated. I was dead wrong about Eisenhower. I didn't begin to realize the sovereign virtues of his detachment and, if you don't mind the word, coldness of his eye on situations. I missed that totally. And having not found out about Eisenhower's peculiar genius, I guess we all know who Eisenhower was. He was president of the United States. Much fun was made of him by us liberals. But having made the discovery around 1963 that he was an administrative genius, or at least drawn the inference that he was, I determined never to be that wrong about anybody again if I can help it. So I've always liked feeling very much the same way about people all the way through. But one of the good things about that is if you take this rather detached attitude about the people you're covering, every now and then they'll do something perfectly awful, and then you'll be ready to get the whole shock of this experience. Whereas if you were prejudiced against them in the first place, you wouldn't have the emotional experience of thinking, God, that man is really just that bad. And it can work the other way. You'll say, that man is just that good. So you don't make up your mind too quickly about anybody. I've had 5. My daughter was in journalism, and now she's a Buddhist. I don't think any of them are in journalism. Only one of them is writing at the present time. And that would be my fourth child. And he's in education, and he writes articles on various things. Very bright, very conscientious. Well, I think it's awfully nice said, but it just isn't so. I mean, the greatest of all newspaper men and women are probably the people in Sarajevo now, or Rwanda, those people. I mean, that's what newspapers are. It isn't commentary. It's awfully nice of David to say that. But David's a much better newspaper man, at least when he was, and he still is, but when he was on the Washington Post. His copy was much better than anything I can think of that I wrote recently, and that's not false modesty. Yes. When did I meet him? I met him very early. I don't think I met him when I was in the Soviet Union, but, you know, he's been around. Yeah, I did do the Pope once or twice. Personally? I used to take walks when I lived in Rome with the Cardinal, who was a perfectly wonderful guy. He was the greatest authority in the Vatican on Freud. And we used to coincide and walk down. He was a very right-wing Pope, but he whooped up Freud, I think, for purposes of heresy trials. And he was a wonderful guy. And I think, you know, I think the Catholic Church is immensely interesting. I mean, I tend to feel that the Catholic Church has been the most important human rights institution in the world in the last 25 years. No. I grew up as an Episcopalian. I'm sometimes rather sorry that my family didn't, whoever my ancestors may have been, that they went with Henry VIII rather than William Byrd, the composer. But, no, but I find the church fascinating. I mean, anything involving a history that long is per se interesting. I think one of the mistakes we make is we do have a habit of abolishing every century but our own. Now we've taken to abolishing every decade but our own. But so that I think if you have an institution like the Catholic Church, which has endured for, what would it be, 1900? Well, I was a young communist. I suppose I thought I was. I was there about a year. Reagan, the President Reagan was never a communist. He started off as a liberal. That is a liberal. No, I don't think, the change I don't think is quite the same. I would have been more extreme on the left than Mr. Reagan was. On the other hand, I think he was more far over to the right than I could ever think of being. I think I'm sort of a Tory or anarchist, I suppose. My favorite political philosopher is Edmund Burke. But the Burke I like is not Burke the philosopher, but Burke with the eye for the specific. I mean, the Burke who knew that a government that cut off Marie Antoinette's head was not going to turn out all right. The Burke who, on India, with his understanding of it, he had this extraordinary capacity for being right in the particular. The general, who's ever right in the general? So that my politics, I suppose my politics are, I mean, I think of myself, I don't know what the word means, I think of myself as a radical. But it's very hard to be a radical because of the downright nature of it. I mean, I cannot imagine sending someone to jail for disagreeing with my opinions. I mean, I cannot imagine hating. I mean, the people I can least appreciate are Republicans who hate Democrats because they're Democrats, and Democrats who hate Republicans because they're Republicans. I just don't. I mean, that I'm just sick and tired of. And so that I don't know what my politics are, but I do know that ideology is terrible. That abstract political thinking is fun, but I think it's a very useless activity, and I think it can be terribly dangerous. I think it's our job to try to describe the little piece of the world that we know. Well, because I was sort of fascinated by the way, one of the things that interests me about Reagan as a governor, and it happens in all of American politics, it's not just Reagan, the solution is announced and it becomes already a given. I mean, I think a good example of that is the Clinton health plan, which people who are more enthusiastic about the president than I am discuss as though it actually existed. And as I recall McClellan, or Mr. McClellan as I called him, he'd made an effort to put Watts, it was after the Watts riot, and he was a very conscientious man, and he had set up a program to rehabilitate the black section of Los Angeles. And Reagan announced that this was a smashing success, and just en passant, I called him McClellan, and he said, look, I haven't been able to get anything done. I haven't been able to get the governor to do anything. I haven't been able to get business to do anything. He says, the only people who are doing anything are the people in the community, but I can't get anything. And meanwhile, everybody was trumpeting the success of this particular plan. And there's a great deal of that in America. Dickens talks about that. When in his book on America, in which, and he hadn't be wrong in this case, but they were building some huge orphanage or boys' home in Philadelphia. And it had been projected 20 years before, it still wasn't finished, although it was finished later on, but I bridled again. Dickens said this, but he said, America is, I forget, it was a wonderful sentence, but it's full of great projects that are all going to be built that were announced 20 years ago and are going to be built next year. It was a better sentence than that, but there's a great deal of our bragging about, in us, of bragging about things that have just not been achieved. And, but I don't think that Governor and then President Reagan was unique for this. But there is this world where it's particularly good in politics, made in politics now, because President Reagan did awfully well with it, and that is a suspicious anecdote. I met a woman who did so-and-so. I met a woman who is a welfare queen and has 3 Cadillacs. Oh, now I don't know who this woman is, where she was or anything, but it becomes part of the lore. And, you know, it's like the lore, I mean, it's like the liberal equivalent of this kind of silly story is the idea that Joe McCarthy was a homosexual, which was propagated by many liberals during his period of glory. I mean, political myths run very deep in our country, and every other country. I mean, I sound like Bosnia is sane and we're crazy, but I think and that's what I think I meant by that business. Westbrook Pegler was a great American sports writer who then became a very famous American columnist, and then allowed his bitterness to carry him away. When I was very young, I read Westbrook Pegler in the newspapers. I used to read Mencken. Mencken was in the Baltimore Sun every Monday, so you grew up reading Mencken and Pegler. And so I was luckier than the people who grew up reading me. But in any case, and I was crazy about Pegler in those days. He was a wonderful writer. And they were wonderful writers in those days. I mean, they're still very good writers now, but the writers of the 20s in newspapers, I don't think have ever been equaled as a lot. And Peg was one of them. Then he went crazy. He began hating Mrs. Roosevelt. He went crazy with hating Mrs. Roosevelt, and he got more and more isolated. And we got fairly close in these late years because I had a tremendous feeling for him. Well, Peg's late years started rather early. It was about 1946 when the bloom got to be sort of off the peach. His great years were, let's say, 25 to 34. And then up until about 37 or 38. And then he got very angry. Well, it's never useful to be angry. What made Peg angry? I don't know. He got angry at Roosevelt, got angry at the unions, got angry at liberals. Maybe he just wanted to get angry. You know, if you allow yourself to think about it, there are a lot of people who make a good living off rage. I mean, I think there are a lot of talk show hosts who come up with, not talk show hosts, but talk commentators mostly, who give you a lot of inauthentic rage. And Peg did that. He was kind of an actor, and he could work himself up and write perfectly wonderful pieces. But the rage was always a little spurious, but then he kept on doing it. And after a while, the rage became everything. I mean, it's hard to explain, but what happens is if you allow yourself, your posture as a writer is very important, I think, to your peace of mind, not to your career particularly. But if you write at a pitch of emotion and rage all the time, I mean, you should only get angry when you have a reason to get angry about something and let it pass otherwise. There'll be times when you'll be angry, and you have to have your anger ready to have it. But if it becomes your technique, in the end you find there's nothing in you but rage. And that's what happened to Pegler, which is why I feel so I never had a father. He never had a son, and we had kind of that kind of relationship in a way. I exaggerate, but in the last stages we did. Peg was in his 70s. I guess he was a year or so younger than I am. Yeah, he used to come to New York fairly in the last years, and then we used to write a lot. Wrote marvelous letters. I lost them all. Peg died when? He died in the 70s. But Buckley was kept up with him. Buckley was a good friend of his. But he's very strange. I don't think Peg realized, I mean, he was very much a working man, but I don't think he realized that there are two classes of people in the world. People who own property and people who work for a living. And that, it's as simple as that. All of us will only be, that is, all of people in my class will only be people who work for a living. We will never be people who own property in that sense. And it's very important to keep the distinction in mind. I mean, it's not, that is not because you're going to throw a bomb into the building or anything, but you just have to understand. And Peg did not understand that. And at one point, we had a very esoteric conversation about the newspaper guild, because he'd been a member of the newspaper guild, and there was going to be a strike, and Peg left the newspaper guild. And he said, I was a private contractor. I was a friend of Roy Howard, who was his publisher. And he said, and I was a private contractor. I wasn't a working man in that sense. So I said to him, you know, after he finished his statement, I said, you know, Roy Howard fired you 10 years later. And he said, yes. I never thought of that. But he didn't understand that. And it's a very important thing to know. It is fascinating, but you know, one of the things is that it shows a good side to people, in a way. You know, people prefer to believe in innocence rather than guilt. It's one of the really best sides of Americans. I mean, you look at the effort to acquit Lee Harvey Oswald. Of course, in order to acquit Lee Harvey Oswald, you have to indict every American institution. But the point is, they want to acquit, you know, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think people have the same generous feeling, in a way, that they would like Alger-Hiss to be innocent. Instead of thinking, well, after all, he didn't do very much. And he's done his time, and did it admirably, as far as I know. As far as everybody who was with him. I mean, one or two mob guys I used to know said he was the best prisoner they ever met when he was in jail. So it's a mixed bag, like everybody else's life, but people do want to believe in innocence, I think. Well, I think Whittaker Chambers is enormously interesting. I think he felt deeply ashamed of himself for his whole life, more ashamed than he should have been, for having testified against his. Actually, his book, Witness, the guilt of being a witness is made more vivid there than his worst enemy could expect to have. He was an extremely interesting man. He exaggerated his place in history, and he exaggerated his place in history. And that's always a mistake, but I think he was a very good man. But I think that both he and Richard Nixon they had feelings of guilt and shame that I've never been able to explain. There was a lot of unnecessary shame in Nixon. And I think most of the heroism of his life was an effort to cover it up. But somewhere there'd been a wound. I don't know whether it's because when he wrote letters to his mother, he said, "Dear Mother, : but there was the feeling that somewhere in his life there'd been a fending off. And, I mean, I hate this kind of thing, but I really do feel it had something to do with it, and it had an awful lot to do with his deep sense of shame and being unfit, which he overcame rather heroically. But he never believed in himself in some strange sort of way. He believed in the struggle, the fight, and everything else. And I think Whittaker Chambers was quite the opposite problem. He never understood that he wasn't all that important. I mean, you see what I'm trying to say? As I put it very badly. Nixon never thought he was up to the job, and Chambers always thought that he was this great historical personage, which he wasn't. I knew Chambers and I knew Nixon. Listen, if you're in journalism, the thing you have to understand, there are millions of people you know who don't know you. That is, the people you met who've forgotten you. But I knew Chambers very, very slightly. I met him very early on, before he became a celebrity. And I liked him. Actually, I worked in the Hopkins Library. He was doing research there. And was a haunted man even at that time. Well, thank you. It was delightful seeing you.